I'm Alex, 26, and everything changed when I opened my family group chat that Tuesday morning to see 17 messages celebrating my cousin Sarah's new job at a marketing firm. $80,000 starting salary, they kept repeating, like it was some kind of magic number that would finally prove someone in our family had made it. The screenshots of her offer letter filled the chat, followed by a parade of congratulations from aunts, uncles, and my parents, all punctuated with not-so-subtle questions about when I would get serious about my career, like she had. Before I continue this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button if you want to hear how this all unfolded. The messages kept coming throughout the morning while I sat in my garage office, surrounded by 3 monitors displaying code that represented 3 years of 18-hour days that my family knew nothing about. Maybe Alex should take notes, my Aunt Linda had written, followed by several laughing emoji. Sarah's showing everyone how it's done. My mother added her own contribution an hour later. We're so proud of Sarah for her dedication and work ethic. Some people in this family could learn from her example. The passive aggression wasn't even passive anymore. It was just aggression wrapped in family group chat politeness. Sarah had always been the golden child, the one who did everything right according to our family's very specific definition of success. She graduated summa cum laude from Northwestern with a business degree, wore blazers to family dinners, and had a LinkedIn profile that read like a corporate success manual. When she got engaged last year, the family group chat buzzed for weeks about her wedding planning and her fiancé's job at a consulting firm. She represented everything our extended family valued, traditional milestones achieved in traditional ways with traditional timelines that made sense to people who measured worth in salary figures and job titles. I had dropped out of college during my junior year to focus full-time on a software project that I was convinced could change everything. My parents had reacted as if I'd announced I was joining a cult. "You're throwing away your future," my father had said during the intervention-style family meeting they'd organized. "Do you want to end up living in our basement forever?" The irony wasn't lost on me that I was indeed living in their basement at the time, but not because I lacked direction. I was there because every penny I could save on rent was going back into development costs and server expenses for a platform that was starting to gain real traction with early beta users. Family gatherings had become exercises in endurance, sitting through conversations where relatives would ask what I was doing with my life, while Sarah fielded questions about her career advancement and salary negotiations. Last Thanksgiving, my Uncle Tom had cornered me by the dessert table to deliver what he clearly thought was motivational advice. "You know, Alex, there's nothing wrong with starting over," he'd said, loading his plate with my grandmother's apple pie. "Sarah didn't get where she is overnight. She put in the work, got her degree, played by the rules. Maybe it's time you considered doing the same." He'd patted my shoulder like I was a lost cause who might still be salvageable with enough family intervention. The truth was that by that Thanksgiving dinner, my company had already secured its first major client contract worth $50,000. I'd been running the platform for local businesses for 8 months, with a small but growing user base that was generating steady revenue. But every time I'd tried to share early wins with family members, I'd been met with polite dismissal or concerned warnings about get-rich-quick schemes. My mother had actually used that exact phrase when I'd mentioned landing my first paying client. "I just don't want you to get your hopes up about these computer things," she'd said. "You need something stable, something real." So I'd stopped trying to explain what I was building. I'd stopped mentioning the late-night client calls or the partnership discussions with other startups. When family members asked what I was doing for work, I'd developed a repertoire of vague responses that seemed to satisfy their need to categorize my failure without giving them anything concrete to criticize. "Still working on some projects," became my standard answer, delivered with just enough resignation to make them feel like they were right about my lack of direction. The morning of Sarah's celebration in the group chat, I was actually preparing for a meeting with investors who had been courting my company for 3 months. The platform had grown to serve over 200 businesses across 4 states, and our monthly recurring revenue had crossed the 6-figure mark the previous quarter. But as I watched the family praise Sarah for securing what they considered a real job, I felt the familiar weight of being perpetually misunderstood by the people who were supposed to know me best. They saw failure where there was actually quiet, methodical success building toward something they couldn't yet comprehend. The pattern of being dismissed by my family hadn't started with Sarah's job announcement. It had been building for years, layer by layer, like sediment settling into something solid and immovable. Sarah had been positioned as the family success story since we were teenagers, while I'd somehow become the cautionary tale they'd reference whenever anyone in our extended network needed an example of wasted potential. During family gatherings, conversations would inevitably turn to career updates, and Sarah would deliver polished summaries of her internships, her networking events, her strategic career moves, while I'd sit quietly knowing that any attempt to share my own progress would be met with the kind of concerned skepticism usually reserved for people announcing they joined pyramid schemes. The last time I'd tried to tell them about a business milestone was 8 months earlier, during my cousin Jake's graduation party. I'd mentioned landing a client contract worth $15,000, thinking maybe this concrete number would finally register as legitimate success. My Aunt Carol had nodded politely before launching into a lecture about the importance of steady employment with benefits. My father had actually pulled me aside later that evening to suggest I look into community college programs for practical skills like plumbing or electrical work. There's always going to be demand for trades, he'd said, as if my software development work was some kind of hobby that would eventually run its course when I matured enough to want real stability. Sarah, meanwhile, had parlayed her business degree into a series of marketing coordinator positions that the family tracked with the dedication of sports fans following playoff statistics. Her LinkedIn updates were screenshot and shared in the family group chat like achievement announcements. When she'd gotten promoted to senior marketing coordinator at her previous company, the celebration had lasted for weeks, with family members analyzing her salary increase and discussing how her smart career choices were paying off. I'd been building my platform for 2 years at that point, working with a growing roster of small business clients and developing features that were starting to gain attention from industry publications, but none of that registered as real progress in their framework of success. The garage office where I spent most of my waking hours had become a secret world that my family couldn't see or understand. While they assumed I was unemployed and probably depressed about my lack of direction, I was actually running an operation that required constant attention and strategic decision-making. My days started at 5 in the morning with server maintenance and client support emails, followed by development work that often stretched past midnight. The irony of being lectured about work ethic while maintaining an 18-hour daily schedule wasn't lost on me, but explaining it felt impossible when my family had already decided that computer work wasn't real work unless it came with a corporate ID badge and a traditional office environment. 3 months before Sarah's job announcement, I'd hired my first full-time employee, a brilliant developer named Marcus who'd been freelancing for tech startups while finishing his computer science degree. The moment when I'd made that offer, sitting in a coffee shop and watching Marcus's face light up as we discussed equity and growth potential, had felt more significant than any graduation ceremony or traditional milestone I'd ever experienced. But when my mother asked what I'd been up to that week, I'd given her the same vague response about working on projects because I knew that mentioning I was now responsible for someone else's livelihood would only trigger more lectures about stability and responsible decision-making. My relationship with Emma had started suffering under the weight of this family secrecy. She'd been encouraging me to be more open about the company's growth, especially after we'd moved out of my parents' basement and into a proper office space downtown. "Why don't you just tell them?" she'd ask after family dinners, where I'd endured another round of career advice from relatives who had no idea what I actually did for work. But Emma hadn't grown up in a family where every deviation from conventional success was treated as a personal failing that reflected poorly on everyone involved. She didn't understand that my family's concern wasn't really about my welfare. It was about their ability to explain my choices to their friends and colleagues. The gap between my actual life and my family's perception of my life had grown so wide that it felt unbridgeable. While they worried about my future and discussed intervention strategies in hushed conversations they thought I couldn't hear, I was actually dealing with the kinds of problems that successful business owners faced: scaling customer support, managing cash flow during rapid growth, and fielding acquisition inquiries from larger companies that had started paying attention to our platform. The $500 contract that I'd celebrated privately in the garage 3 years earlier had evolved into monthly revenue that exceeded what Sarah would make in her new job, but sharing that information felt impossible when my family had already invested so much energy in their narrative about my lack of direction. The morning of the group chat celebration for Sarah's $80,000 salary, I'd actually been preparing for a call with Forbes magazine. A journalist had reached out 3 weeks earlier about including me in their annual 30 under 30 list for technology entrepreneurs. The irony of timing wasn't lost on me as I watched my family praise Sarah for achieving what they considered real success while I was being recognized by one of the most prestigious business publications in the country. But I'd learned to keep these moments to myself, understanding that my family's love was conditional on their ability to understand and categorize my achievements within their limited framework of what success looked like. Building a company in complete silence while your family thinks you're unemployed creates a strange kind of psychological split that I wasn't prepared for when I made the decision to stop sharing my progress with them. Every morning, I'd eat breakfast with my parents in their kitchen, listening to my mother worry aloud about my lack of direction, while I mentally reviewed the client calls scheduled for that day and the feature releases we were planning for the following week. The cognitive dissonance was exhausting, maintaining two completely separate versions of reality depending on which room of the house I was in. My days followed a routine that would have impressed even the most demanding corporate manager, but since it happened in a converted garage behind a suburban house, it remained invisible to everyone who mattered to me personally. I'd wake up at 5:30, check overnight support tickets and server metrics, then spend the next 12 to 14 hours building, testing, and refining a platform that was processing thousands of transactions weekly for small businesses across the Midwest. During family dinners, when my father would ask what I'd accomplished that day, I'd give non-committal answers about working on some coding stuff, while internally calculating the revenue we generated and the new features we'd deployed. The isolation became more pronounced as the company's success accelerated. 6 months after hiring Marcus, we brought on Sarah Chen, a user experience designer whose previous work with fintech startups had caught my attention during our platform redesign. The day we made her the offer, sitting in our cramped office space above a used bookstore downtown, felt like a validation of everything I'd been building in secret. But when I came home that evening to find my parents discussing whether I needed therapy to address my work avoidance issue, the disconnect between their perception and my reality felt almost surreal. Emma had started attending family events less frequently, frustrated by what she saw as my unwillingness to advocate for myself. "They think you're depressed and unmotivated," she'd pointed out after my cousin Jake's birthday party, where my Uncle Tom had cornered me again with advice about applying for entry-level positions at local companies. "Why do you let them think that when you're actually building something incredible?" But explaining the psychological complexity of my family dynamics felt impossible, especially when I wasn't entirely sure I understood them myself. Their concern felt genuine, but it was concern based on a fundamental misunderstanding of who I was and what I was capable of achieving. The financial success was becoming impossible to hide through practical necessities, though I'd gotten creative about maintaining the facade of struggle. When we moved out of my parents' basement into a downtown apartment, I'd told them about a small freelance project that was covering rent temporarily. When I'd bought a reliable car to replace the 15-year-old Honda that had been breaking down weekly, I'd explained it as a lease deal I'd found through a friend. The mental gymnastics required to downplay every improvement in my circumstances while maintaining their narrative about my lack of progress was becoming its own full-time job. Our client base had grown to include 3 major regional restaurant chains and a logistics company that processed millions in annual revenue. The platform was handling more transaction volume in a single month than Sarah would see in her new marketing position over an entire year. But these achievements existed in a parallel universe that my family couldn't access or acknowledge. During the company's first quarterly business review, when we'd projected growth that would put us on track for 8-figure annual revenue within 18 months, I'd driven home to find my mother leaving career counseling brochures on my desk with a note about exploring options for people who need help finding. The emotional toll of this was starting to affect every aspect of my life. I'd become hypervigilant about accidentally revealing it that might expose the scale of what I was building. When my phone rang during family dinners with calls from clients or investors, I'd let them go to voicemail and check the messages later in private. When packages arrived at my parents' house addressed to the company name, I'd intercept them before anyone could ask questions about what kind of hobby project required overnight shipping of enterprise-grade hardware. The hardest part wasn't the secrecy itself, but the way it required me to accept my family's diminished expectations as a necessary protective barrier. Every concerned conversation about my future, every gentle suggestion about realistic career goals, every worried discussion about my lack of traditional milestones felt like a betrayal of the person I'd actually become. But defending myself would have meant revealing the full scope of my success. And I'd learned through years of dismissal that my family wasn't equipped to process information that contradicted their established narrative about my capabilities and choices. 3 weeks before the Forbes journalist first contacted me, our platform had been acquired by a venture capital firm for a valuation that put my personal net worth into 7 figures. The morning after we'd signed the acquisition paperwork, I'd sat at my parents' breakfast table listening to my father suggest I consider applying for seasonal work at the local mall, since any job experience is better than no job experience. The irony was so complete it felt like performance art. but I'd nodded seriously and promised to think about it while mentally reviewing the equity distribution charts that had made me financially independent before my 27th birthday. The family intervention happened on a Thursday evening in March, 2 weeks after my Uncle Tom had apparently called my parents to express serious concerns about my trajectory. I walked into what I thought was a casual family dinner to find my parents, Sarah, my Aunt Linda, and Uncle Tom arranged around the dining room table with the kind of serious expressions usually reserved for terminal diagnoses or bankruptcy announcements. My mother gestured toward an empty chair they'd positioned at the head of the table, and I realized with growing dread that I was about to become the subject of a coordinated effort to salvage what they perceived as my failing life. "We're worried about you, Alex," my father began, his voice carrying the rehearsed tone of someone who'd practiced this conversation multiple times. "You're 26 years old and you're still living like you're in college. No steady job, no real responsibilities, no clear direction." Sarah nodded sympathetically from across the table, her expression a careful mixture of concern and superiority that I'd seen countless times during our childhood. She'd driven down from Chicago specifically for this intervention, taking time away from her important new position to help address the family crisis that was my apparent inability to launch into adulthood. Uncle Tom leaned forward with the confidence of someone who'd built a successful insurance business and assumed his expertise transferred to all other industries. "The thing is, Alex, we've all been patient, thinking you'd figure things out on your own. But it's been 3 years since you dropped out of college, and what do you have to show for it?" He gestured vaguely toward me as if my existence itself was evidence of failure. "Your cousin Sarah has worked her way up through 3 different companies. She's got real skills, real experience that employers value. Meanwhile, you're playing around with computers in the garage like it's some kind of hobby that's going to magically turn into a career." My Aunt Linda had prepared what appeared to be a formal presentation about the importance of foundational employment experience. She'd brought printouts of job listings from local companies, entry-level positions in customer service and administrative work that she insisted would provide the stability and structure I needed to develop proper work habits. "Nobody expects you to start at the top," she explained, spreading the job listings across the table like evidence in a court case. "But you need to start somewhere real, somewhere that will teach you how professional environments actually work." The conversation continued for 2 hours, each family member taking turns explaining their perspective on my situation, while I sat silently absorbing the growing realization that they genuinely believed they were helping me. Sarah shared insights from her own career journey, emphasizing how her willingness to pay her dues in junior positions had taught her valuable lessons about workplace dynamics and professional growth. My mother talked about her concerns for my mental health, wondering if my isolation and lack of traditional milestones indicated depression or anxiety that might benefit from professional intervention. What made the intervention particularly surreal was the timing. That same week, I'd been negotiating a partnership agreement with a Fortune 500 company that wanted to integrate our platform into their vendor management system. The deal would have guaranteed minimum annual revenue in the mid-7 figures while positioning us for potential acquisition discussions within the next 18 months. But as I listened to my family discuss whether I might benefit from career counseling or vocational rehabilitation services, I couldn't figure out how to bridge the gap between their perception and my reality without sounding delusional or defensive. The breaking point came when Sarah offered to put in a good word for me with her company's human resources department. "They're always looking for people who are willing to start in support roles and work their way up," she said, her tone suggesting this was an extraordinary act of generosity. "It's not glamorous, but it would get you started in a real company with real growth potential. You could learn what it actually takes to succeed in business." The condescension was so complete and unconscious that I almost admired its purity, but it also crystallized my understanding that my family's love was fundamentally conditional on their ability to categorize and control my choices. When the intervention finally ended, I'd agreed to seriously consider their suggestions, while privately deciding that I was done trying to manage their expectations or protect their feelings about my unconventional path. The next morning, I moved the last of my personal belongings out of my parents' house and into the downtown apartment that Emma and I had been sharing for the past 6 months. My mother cried as I loaded boxes into my car, interpreting the move as further evidence of my instability rather than a natural step toward independence that should have happened years earlier. The following week brought Sarah's promotion celebration dinner at an upscale restaurant downtown, another mandatory family event where I was expected to participate in congratulating her latest achievement. while absorbing more gentle lectures about getting my life together. Sarah had been promoted to senior marketing manager with a substantial salary increase, and the family treated this milestone as validation of their entire worldview about success and professional development. During cocktails, my cousin Jake cornered me near the bar to deliver his own version of career advice, suggesting I consider pursuing certifications in practical technology skills like network administration or database management. The dinner itself became an exercise in endurance as family members took turns offering Sarah congratulations while finding subtle ways to reference my ongoing failure to achieve similar milestones. "It's so wonderful to see someone really applying themselves and getting results," my Aunt Linda said, her eyes meaningfully meeting mine across the table. Sarah graciously accepted the praise while occasionally glancing in my direction, with what I assumed was supposed to be encouraging solidarity, as if we were teammates in the same game rather than people playing by completely different rules. By the time dessert arrived, I'd made a decision that felt both inevitable and liberating. I was done participating in family narratives that required me to diminish my actual achievements in order to maintain their comfortable assumptions about my capabilities. The Forbes interview request had been sitting in my email for 3 days, and I'd been hesitating because I knew that any public recognition would expose the elaborate fiction I'd been maintaining about my professional life. But sitting in that restaurant, listening to my family celebrate Sarah's $80,000 salary while dismissing my work as expensive hobbies, I realized that protecting their feelings had become a form of self-betrayal that I could no longer sustain. The decision to maintain complete radio silence about my business success after that dinner created a strange sense of freedom that I hadn't anticipated. For the first time in 3 years, I stopped monitoring my family's expectations or trying to manage their perceptions of my choices. When my mother called to check on my job search progress, I'd give brief, non-committal responses and change the subject to safer topics like weather or her garden. The mental energy I'd been spending on maintaining their narrative about my failure was suddenly available for the actual work of scaling a rapidly growing company. Our platform crossed the $1 million annual revenue mark on a Tuesday morning in April. While I was reviewing customer acquisition metrics in our expanded office space, Marcus found me staring at the dashboard numbers, not quite believing what I was seeing despite months of steady growth that had pointed toward this milestone. "We actually did it," he said, looking over my shoulder at the screen that displayed our monthly recurring revenue, customer retention rates, and projected quarterly earnings. The moment felt significant enough to warrant some kind of celebration, but I realized I had no one in my personal life who would understand the magnitude of what we'd accomplished. Emma had started asking fewer questions about my work, partly because she was dealing with her own career transition into nonprofit management, but also because my family's dismissal of my achievements had created a complicated dynamic where success felt almost shameful to discuss. When I tried to share the revenue milestone with her that evening, she congratulated me warmly, but with the slightly bewildered expression of someone who couldn't quite process the scale of what I was describing. "That's incredible, Alex," she said, "but maybe now it's time to tell your family what you've actually been building. They deserve to know how wrong they've been about you." But the gap between my family's perception and my reality had grown so wide that bridging it felt more complicated than simply revealing financial figures. They'd invested 3 years in believing that my work was essentially elaborate procrastination, and challenging that belief would require them to acknowledge that their advice, their interventions, and their constant worry had been based on fundamental misunderstandings about my capabilities and choices. The Forbes interview request that I'd been avoiding felt like a safer way to let the truth emerge organically, without forcing difficult conversations about judgment and family dynamics. The hiring process had accelerated as our client base expanded into markets we hadn't originally targeted. Sarah Chen had proven invaluable during our platform redesign, and her recommendation led us to recruit David Kim, a business development specialist whose previous experience with SaaS startups had taught him how to identify and pursue enterprise clients. The day we made David an offer, our team had grown to 7 full-time employees plus 3 contractors. But when my father asked what I'd been doing that week, I maintained my usual vague response about working on some projects with a few other people. The financial success was becoming increasingly difficult to downplay through practical necessities. Our office lease had expanded to include the entire second floor of the building, and the equipment purchases necessary for supporting our growing infrastructure were substantial enough that maintaining the facade of struggling freelancer required constant creativity. When family members asked about my living situation or transportation, I'd developed a repertoire of partial truths that satisfied their curiosity without revealing the full scope of my financial independence. The irony of my family's continued concern about my future, while I was fielding acquisition inquiries from companies they'd recognized, became a source of dark humor that I could only share with Emma and my business partners. 3 different venture capital firms had reached out through various channels, expressing interest in either investing in our next growth phase or facilitating acquisition discussions with their portfolio companies. One of the inquiries came from a firm that had recently acquired Sarah's current employer, though I doubted she knew about the connection, or would recognize the significance if she did. The Forbes journalist, Rebecca Martinez, had been persistent but patient in her follow-up emails, explaining that their 30 under 30 list for technology was designed to highlight people who were disrupting traditional industries through innovative platform solutions. Her description of my company's impact on small business operation was more accurate than anything I ever said about my work, despite their having 3 years to observe and understand what I was building. 2 weeks before my scheduled Forbes interview, our platform processed its largest single-day transaction in history, handling payments for 1,500 small businesses across 6 states. The revenue generated in that 24-hour period exceeded Sarah's, and the achievement existed in a parallel universe and couldn't act. When I came home that evening to help me for entries at local tech companies, the disconnect felt so complete that I almost laughed out. The conversation with Martinez was scheduled for the day after Sarah's job announcement. As I watched my relatives praise her $80,000 salary with the enthusiasm reserved for lottery winnership victories, I was mentally prepared about scaling, managing rapid team growth, and maintaining platform stability during exponential revenue increases. The timing felt cosmically appropriate, as if the universe was setting up some kind of elaborate joke about perception and reality. Emma had suggested that maybe the Forbes recognition would provide a natural opportunity to bridge the gap with my family, but I'd learned to be cautious about assuming that external validation would change internal dynamics. My family's investment in their narrative about my lack of direction had become so central to their understanding of our relationships that challenging it might threaten more than just their assumptions about my career. The morning of my Forbes interview, as I reviewed the company valuation figures that would soon become public information, I realized I was about to find out whether their love for me was strong enough to survive the revelation that their fundamental understanding of my life had been completely wrong for the past 3 years. The morning of my Forbes interview, I woke up to 17 notifications on my phone from the family group chat celebrating Sarah's new job announcement. While I was making coffee and reviewing the talking points Rebecca Martinez had sent me the night before, my relatives were dissecting every detail of Sarah's offer letter like sports commentators analyzing a championship victory. The salary figure of $80,000 appeared in multiple messages, each time accompanied by variations of the same theme about finally seeing someone in the family get serious about their career. The interview was scheduled for 10 o'clock, but I'd blocked off the entire morning because Rebecca had mentioned they might want to do a photo shoot at our office location if the conversation went well. As I drove downtown, my phone continued buzzing with family messages that I ignored out of habit, not realizing that their timing would create the perfect storm of irony that was about to unfold. My Aunt Linda had contributed her usual observations about setting a good example for everyone else, while my Uncle Tom had launched into a detailed analysis of salary progression in marketing careers. Rebecca Martinez turned out to be sharper and more prepared than I'd expected. Having done extensive research on our platform's market position and growth trajectory, she'd spoken with several of our major clients and had clearly done her homework on the competitive landscape we were navigating. "What's interesting about your company," she said, settling into the conference room overlooking downtown traffic, "is how you've managed to scale so rapidly while maintaining profitability. Most startups your age are still burning through investor capital, but you've built something genuinely sustainable." The conversation lasted nearly 3 hours, covering everything from our technology stack to our customer retention strategies to the partnerships that had enabled our expansion into new markets. Rebecca was particularly interested in the decision to bootstrap rather than seek early venture capital, and I found myself explaining the advantages of maintaining control during rapid growth phases. "The valuation we're seeing now," she said, referencing notes that included figures I hadn't shared publicly before, "puts you in pretty exclusive company for entrepreneurs under 30. How does it feel to have built something this significant while most of your peers are still figuring out their career paths?" During a break in our conversation, I checked my phone to find that the family group chat had continued its celebration of Sarah's achievement, with newer messages analyzing the benefits package and discussing how her success proved that hard work and dedication really do pay off. My mother had contributed a particularly pointed observation about how some people in the family could learn from Sarah's example of commitment and follow-through. The irony was so perfect it felt scripted, but I put the phone away without responding, focusing instead on the photographer who had arrived to capture images for the magazine spread. The photo set required me to be in various locations around our office, highlighting the team I'd built, and the infrastructure we'd developed support our growing. Standing in front of the wall and partnership I realized would soon be public of everything to see or acknowledge. The photographer captured shots of me working alongside Marcus and Sarah Chen, our expanded team collaborating on feature development, and the technology setup that powered transactions for businesses across. Rebecca's final questions focused on the human in our platform. She'd interviewed several clients who had credited our payment processing and inventory management features with enabling growth they couldn't have achieved otherwise. "You're not just building software," she observed. "You're actually changing how entire industries operate at the small business level. That's the kind of impact we look for in our 30 under 30 selections." After the interview concluded, I drove home feeling a mixture of excitement and apprehension about what would happen when the article was published. The photographer had mentioned that the magazine would be hitting newsstands within the next 2 weeks, with the online version going live simultaneously. As I pulled into my apartment building's parking garage, my phone buzzed with another family group chat message. This one from my father suggesting that maybe I should reach out to Sarah for career advice since she'd obviously figured out how to navigate professional environments successfully. That evening, Emma found me staring at my laptop screen, oscillating between anticipation and dread about the article's publication. "Are you having second thoughts about doing the interview?" she asked, settling beside me on the couch. I explained that it wasn't the interview itself that worried me, but the inevitable family reaction when they discovered that their fundamental assumptions about my life had been completely wrong for years. "Maybe this will finally help them understand what you've been building," she suggested, but I wasn't optimistic about their ability to process information that contradicted such deeply held beliefs about my capabilities. The family group chat continued its analysis of Sarah's career achievement late into the evening, with relatives contributing increasingly elaborate praise for her mature approach to professional development and her realistic understanding of what it takes to succeed in today's economy. My cousin Jake had added his own perspective about how Sarah's success demonstrated the value of traditional career paths and proven strategies, while my Aunt Carol had shared a lengthy message about the importance of learning from family members who make smart choices. As I finally turned off my phone and prepared for bed, I realized that tomorrow would likely be the last day that my family's perception of my life would remain unchallenged by external reality. The Forbes article would force them to confront not just their misunderstanding of my achievements, but their entire framework for evaluating success and potential within our family dynamics. Whether that confrontation would lead to genuine reconciliation or deeper defensiveness remained to be seen, but I was finally ready to find out which version of their love was real. The conditional support based on their expectations, or something deeper that could survive the revelation that their assumptions about me had been fundamentally wrong from the beginning. The Forbes article went live at 6 a.m. on a Wednesday, 2 weeks after my interview with Rebecca Martinez. I was in our office reviewing quarterly projections when my phone started buzzing with notifications that seemed to multiply exponentially every few minutes. The first screenshot appeared in the family group chat at 6:47, posted by my cousin Jake with no accompanying message. Just the image of the Forbes website header and my photograph prominently displayed under the headline, 30 under 30 Tech Entrepreneurs Disrupting Traditional Industries. By 7:15, the group chat had exploded into a frenzy of activity, unlike anything I'd ever seen from my normally reserved extended family. Screenshot after screenshot flooded the conversation, the article text highlighting our $47 million valuation, quotes from clients praising our platform's impact on their businesses, the photo of me standing confidently in our expanded office space surrounded by the team I'd built. My Aunt Linda had apparently read the entire article twice, posting excerpts that detailed our revenue growth and market expansion with increasingly frantic commentary about how this changed everything. The first direct message came from my mother at 7:28. "Alex, we need to talk. Call me immediately. This can't be real." Her text was followed within minutes by similar messages from my father, both my brothers, and several relatives I hadn't heard from. Uncle Tom had apparently tried calling me 6 before sending a text that simply read, "What the hell is going on? Why didn't you tell us?" The desperation in these messages, but I was in the middle of a call with a restaurant that was expanding their integration on our platform. Sarah's reaction arrived at 8:45 in the form of a private message that bypassed the group chat. "I don't understand this is possible. The articles. We thought you were unemployed. We thought you needed help. How could you let us believe that while you were building something this big?" Her confusion felt genuine, but it was layered with something that might have been hurt or embarrassment at realizing how completely she'd misunderstood our relative positions in the family hierarchy. The family group chat had devolved into a mixture of celebration and damage control, as relatives tried to process information that contradicted 3 years of established narrative about my failure to launch. My Aunt Carol had posted a message about always knowing I had special potential. while conveniently forgetting her contributions to the intervention that had occurred just months earlier. Uncle Tom had shifted into business mode, suddenly interested in details about our client acquisition strategies and growth projections, as if his insurance industry expertise qualified him to analyze my company's performance. By mid-morning, the local news stations had picked up the Forbes story, with 2 different outlets reaching out for follow-up interviews about the young entrepreneur who built a multi-million-dollar company from his parents' garage. The irony of media recognition forcing my family to acknowledge what they'd been unable to see when it was happening in their own basement wasn't lost on me, but I was too busy managing the influx of new business inquiry to fully appreciate the cosmic justice of the situation. Emma texted me around noon with updates about the family's increasingly frantic attempts to reach me through various channels. "Your mom called me 3 times asking if I knew about the company," she wrote. "Your dad showed up at my office wanting to know why I didn't tell them. They're completely losing it." The desperation in their outreach suggested they were beginning to understand not just the scale of my success, but the implications of their 3-year misunderstanding of my capabilities and choices. The afternoon brought a new wave of family messages as relatives began sharing the Forbes article with their own social networks, suddenly proud to claim association with my achievement. My cousin Jake had posted the article on his LinkedIn profile with commentary about family entrepreneurship and being inspired by innovative thinking. Aunt Linda had shared it on Facebook with a caption about how our family had always supported creative thinking and business development. The revisionist history was breathtaking in its completeness and shamelessness. Sarah called me directly at 4:30, her voice shaking with what sounded like a mixture of emotions I couldn't entirely identify. "Alex, I need you to explain this to me," she said without preamble. "The article says your company processes payments for hundreds of businesses. It says you have employees and office space and partnerships with major corporations. How is that possible when you've been living like you couldn't afford rent?" Her voice cracked slightly on the last question, and I realized she was crying. The conversation with Sarah lasted 47 minutes, during which I explained the basic timeline of the company's development while she struggled to reconcile this information with her memories of family interventions and career advice sessions. "We thought we were helping you," she kept repeating, as if trying to convince herself that their concern had been justified, despite being based on completely inaccurate assumptions. "We thought you needed guidance. We thought you were lost." The pain in her voice was real, but it was complicated by what seemed like embarrassment at realizing how condescending she'd been towards someone who was actually more successful than she was. By evening, the family group chat had reached a new level of surreal desperation as relatives tried to retroactively position themselves as supporters of my entrepreneurial journey. Messages appeared, claiming that they'd always believed in my potential and had been waiting for the right moment to see my talents flourish. My father posted a lengthy message about how proud he was of my determination and vision, conveniently omitting any reference to the intervention or the career counseling brochures he'd left on my desk just months earlier. The most revealing response came from my mother in a private message sent at 9:30 that evening. "We love you and we're proud of you, but we don't understand why you felt like you had to hide this from us. We're your family. We would have supported you if we'd known what you were really doing." The message captured perfectly the fundamental disconnect that had driven my decision to maintain secrecy. Their love was contingent on their ability to understand and approve of my choices rather than trusting my judgment even when my path didn't make sense to them. As I finally turned off my phone that night, the family group chat was still active with relatives analyzing every detail of the Forbes article and sharing their own interpretations of what my success meant for our family's reputation and future dynamics. The screenshots would continue appearing for days, but the damage to their established narrative about my capabilities had been done. Tomorrow would bring the complicated work of figuring out whether our relationships could survive the revelation that their fundamental understanding of my life had been completely wrong, and whether their love for me was strong enough to acknowledge the depth of their misjudgment without retreating into defensiveness or revisionist history. The weeks following the Forbes article publication felt like watching my family undergo a collective, psychological recalibration in real time. Their initial frenzy of damage control and retroactive pride gradually gave way to a more complex reckoning, with the implications of their 3-year misunderstanding of my life. Some relatives doubled down on revisionist history, insisting they'd always believed in my potential, while others seemed genuinely shaken by the realization that their concern and advice had been based on fundamentally flawed assumptions about my capabilities and choices. My mother requested a face-to-face meeting 3 weeks after the article went live, suggesting we have lunch at a restaurant downtown where we could talk privately without the interference of other family members. She arrived looking older than I remembered, her usual confidence replaced by something that looked like uncertainty mixed with maternal guilt. I've been thinking about this constantly since the Forbes thing came out, she said, not touching the salad she'd ordered. I keep trying to understand how we got it so wrong, how we spent 3 years worrying about you when you were actually building something incredible. The conversation that followed was unlike any discussion we'd ever had, characterized by a level of honesty that felt both overdue and slightly uncomfortable. She acknowledged that their family dynamic had always struggled with anything that deviated from conventional success markers, and that my unconventional path had triggered their anxiety about social judgment and financial security. We measured your progress against Sarah's timeline because hers made sense to us, she admitted. College, internships, entry-level jobs, promotions. We could track that. We could explain it to our friends. But what you were doing in the garage just looked like expensive hobbies. Sarah herself had requested her own private conversation, which took place the following week at a coffee shop near her office in Chicago. She seemed diminished somehow, her usual confidence replaced by something that might have been embarrassment or professional insecurity. The worst part, she said, stirring her latte obsessively, is realizing that while I was giving you career advice, you were already more successful than I'll probably ever be. The company you built processes more revenue in a month than I'll make in years, and I was sitting there lecturing you about entry-level positions and networking strategies. Our conversation revealed layers of family dynamics that I hadn't fully understood during our childhood. Sarah admitted that she'd felt pressure to be the family success story, the one who proved that their traditional values and conventional expectations actually worked. My apparent failure to launch had somehow validated her choices, while my hidden success retroactively undermined the framework that had made her achievements feel meaningful. I don't know how to process the fact that you were building something amazing while I was feeling sorry for you, she said quietly. The broader family response evolved through predictable stages of grief and adjustment. Uncle Tom had initially tried to position himself as a business mentor, offering advice about scaling and market expansion based on his insurance industry experience. When I politely declined his suggestions during a family barbecue, explaining that we already had experienced advisors and clear growth strategy, his enthusiasm cooled noticeably. The realization that his nephew didn't need his guidance seemed to challenge his understanding of his role within our... Emma observed these family dynamics with a mixture of vindication and concern, having watched me struggle with their They're trying to process 3 years of where relatives kept asking detailed questions, new projection, and client act. Some of them are handling it, but they're all dealing with the advice and concern. The most challenging act was determining. I wanted to maintain with family members who had spent years fundamentally misunderstanding my character and capabilities. Their newfound pride in my achievements felt hollow when measured against their previous dismissal and condescension. The intervention they'd organized just months earlier had been based on genuine concern, but it had also revealed how little they actually knew about my daily life, my values, or my decision-making process. 6 months after the Forbes article, our family dynamic had settled into a new equilibrium that acknowledged my success while carefully avoiding detailed examination of their previous misjudgments. Family gatherings became more pleasant but also more superficial, with relatives asking polite questions about business growth while steering clear of conversations that might highlight how wrong their assessments had been. Sarah and I developed a cordial relationship that lacked the competitive undertones of our earlier interactions, but it was built on mutual respect rather than genuine intimacy. The company continued growing beyond the metrics that had initially shocked my family, with acquisition offers that eventually led to a successful exit that provided financial independence for my entire team. Emma and I used our portion of the proceeds to start a foundation focused on supporting young entrepreneurs whose unconventional approaches might not fit traditional family or institutional expectations. The irony of using money generated by family rejection to help other people navigate similar challenges wasn't lost on either of us. Looking back on that morning when I'd ignored the family group chat celebration of Sarah's $80,000 salary while preparing for my Forbes interview, I realized that the experience had taught me something valuable about the difference between seeking validation and building self-worth. My family's love had always been conditional on their ability to understand and approve of my choices, but learning to succeed without their recognition had been more liberating than finally receiving their belated acknowledgement. The young man who had dropped out of college and endured years of family concern about his lack of direction had been replaced by someone who understood that the most important validation comes from the work itself, from the problems you solve and the value you create, regardless of whether the people closest to you can see or appreciate what you're building. Sometimes the best thing family can do for you is underestimate your potential so completely that you stop trying to meet their expectations and start exceeding your own instead.